In the old movie All About Eve, Betty Davis has a line that's lived through the years. And at one point she says, "Fasten your seat belts, it's going to be a bumpy ride." I say that because I've decided I'm going to go heavy. You know, it's one of the problems that homilists face is to decide exactly how they're going to organize and present the material and what kind of depth they're going to go into. And since, of course, we have a limited time, the tendency is to be relatively surface. But we're celebrating a feast today that only comes once a year, and I think it's a celebration that the church has undervalued. And I'm going to explain why. Recently, I read Pope Leo's apostolic release that he's the Delexi Te, I loved you. It's a quote from Jesus. It's an exhortation. Now, it was begun by Pope Francis, but he didn't complete it before his death, and Leo has finished it. And as I was reading it, I decided I needed to go back and reread Pope Francis's encyclical from a years back, Laudato Si. That was his one in which he dealt with the environment, the responsibility of the Christian toward our created environment. And then I went back and looked at Delexi Te, and I noticed that both of them, both popes, were emphasizing something about creation. Now, not just creation in the sense of the creation of life on earth or of our soul. They were talking about creation, the whole Megillah, everything. Not just earth in a little far distant suburb of the Milky Way, not just about the Milky Way, 100 billion stars among, God only knows, 200 billion, maybe more than that, other galaxies. Right? Solar systems, each of which would have perhaps billions of these. I mean, the vastness of the universe is something that if you begin thinking about it before you go to sleep, it'll keep you awake at night. And yet, does that mean it's unimportant? We're here because of this celebration for the passage, or the title is the celebration of the faithful departed. Now, I think that's a little too restrictive. There's a passage here that I just read from the Gospel of John, where there's two sentences which I think, in a sense, kind of contradict one another. He says, "This is the will of one who sent me, that I should not lose anything of what he gave me." I should not lose anything. Not anyone, anything. And then just below that it says, "This is the will of my Father, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have eternal life." Now, this is a problem that the early church recognized early. Okay, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him. Well, what about those who didn't see the Son and don't believe in him? They maybe never even heard of him. This was one of the questions that arose. And of course, they did not realize how big the earth was relative to their own experience. The vast numbers of people, not to mention all those that were to come, many of whom never heard the name Jesus, many of whom, when they heard the name Jesus, they heard it from violent conquerors, people who treated them with disrespect and with great violence. So what about them? Well, I think it goes beyond that. I think that Pope Francis's and Pope Leo's insight into the nature of creation is something that we need, as a people, we need to deal with. When the priest for this particular Mass is given, most Masses you have a particular color. Generally it's green as the ordinary time, red as if you're celebrating the Mass of a martyr, and white is the more common for celebration. But for this Mass, the priest could wear violet or black. And I chose white precisely because I want to talk about something that is so glorious, it's almost incomprehensible. I want to talk about not only how we relate to those of the faith who have gone before us, but how we relate to the very creation that we are an intimate and integral part of, right? Now, there's all kinds of difficult and complex questions that can arise around this, and I'd like to take some time to explore that a little bit. There was a physicist who I read some years back, and I can't remember the name of this particular scholar. Some of you who are a little more adept in that particular field might be able to inform me. But he made a comment once, and he said, every time in the natural sciences we get a question answered, we get 2 new questions at least. In other words, it seems like the more we know, the more we know we don't know. And that reminded me of Socrates. Socrates said, the wise ones are the ones who know how much they don't know. Okay? And so that opens the whole question of what in at least in the world of theology, we would say infinity. The mystery of existence. Now, I know there are people, scientists and otherwise, who say, when you ask where did the universe come from, and they say it was just there. Well, if you can believe that it was just there, and that makes more sense to you than the idea of a creator, more power to you. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. And of course, now we have the idea of the so-called Big Bang. The question, however, that doesn't answer the question, because where did that come from? I hope, and maybe you don't, to realize that the first proposal for what we now call the Big Bang Theory was from a Catholic priest who was an astrophysicist. Father Lemaitre, Georges Lemaitre. He was a Belgian astrophysicist. He died in 1962. He was Belgian by birth. He taught at Oxford. He taught at MIT. He taught at Caltech. He worked with Albert Einstein and George Gamow and some of the important physicists of his era. And he was the first one who, reading the data from the Hubble, Dr. Hubble, the astronomer, who noticed that wherever you took a photograph of the stars, the night light, wherever on Earth you took it, that when you ran it through a spectrograph, you got red light. Now, physicists say that is indicative of something moving away. Well, if everywhere you look, everything you see is moving away, that means, and this is what Lemaitre came up with, that means at some time, and he talked about infinity, the singularity, the point at which the laws of physics come into existence, the so-called Big Bang. But don't think of the Big Bang as an explosion, which is our tendency to think of, stick a dynamite in a table in an empty room and it blows up and it fills up the Big Bang doesn't explode in space. It creates space. Outside of the parameters of the Big Bang, there's nothing, real nothing, absolute nothing. Not just sort of emptiness or barrenness, nothing. Ponder that one while you're trying to go to sleep. Okay? And the point, of course, is many people rejected that thinking, many scientists, partly because it seemed to imply the possibility, at least, of a creator. Now, Lemaitre was aware of that, and he was very cautious to say that's not what he was saying. Although he said he did believe that, he was not saying that. He was just simply saying, this seems to explain what we're looking at. That's how Western science works. You see a phenomenon, you come up and say, well, how could this be? What does that imply? You propose a hypothesis, and then you let the others test it. And if the testing comes out positive often enough, you have a theory. A theory is not, as in ordinary language, a guess. A theory has data behind it. Ask the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki about the effectiveness of atomic theory. But a theory doesn't explain everything. And it would appear, and I think that's what some of these physicists I've been talking about are saying, is maybe there is something more than meets the eye. Maybe there is something more than what can be measured, weighed, balanced, portrayed, summed up in equations or in paragraphs. Maybe there is something more. We have, I read a book recently. It had been recommended to me for some years ago, and I was kind of afraid of it, by a physicist by the name of James Jeans. His Jeans. He was English. And he wrote a book that was published in 1930 called Our Mysterious Universe. And Professor Jeans was one of the early exponents of what's called quantum mechanics. And the problem with quantum mechanics is that it seems to be a universe that is open to randomness, that's open to the inexplicable. Schrodinger's cat, if you don't know what that is, Google it. You know, the uncertainty principle of Heisenberg, that somehow or other, if you want to know where a political particle is, you can do that, but if you can't know its velocity. If you want to know its velocity, then you can't know where it's at. There seems to be much about the universe that just can't be pinned down. Again, what does this imply? And then you have the whole problem of meaning. Now, as far as we know, we're the only creatures in creation. Now, creation is vast, and who knows how many other forms of life, of conscious, self-conscious life there are. But we haven't yet encountered any. We haven't detected any. We don't know for sure. But the universe is one big mass, okay? Most of it will never be accessible to us, ever. And we look up at the sky, and we have a sense of wonder. Well, that's a problem in itself. Where does that come from, that sense of wonder? You know, I have somewhere in my pocket, I have a little device that knows more and has access to more data than all of us put together. And it gets to it a lot quicker than we can. Okay? But I have never had my phone, when I ask a question, when it gets the answer and says, oh, that was satisfying, let's do it again. Or when I ask it to look up a quote I looked up the quote from Betty Davis on it. It didn't say, yeah, that was clever. Never get the sense that it's happy or sad about anything. It's never excited about anything. Later tonight, I will check it to see that we're in the 7th game of the World Series. I'll check to see if it's the Dodgers or Toronto. It won't care. Okay? It's not a fan of either one. Okay? The computer doesn't have consciousness. Our name as a species is Homo sapiens sapiens. It means man knowing that he knows. Okay? We have experience. Now, there is nobody on earth who can explain how that happens. Another philosopher, David Chalmers, Australian philosopher, came up with what is called the hard question of consciousness. How is it that a purely physical mechanism in our heads can produce an inner feeling? Because basically, what happens here is an inner mechanism, but that phone has no feeling. Your laptop has no feeling. No machine has a feeling about something. It doesn't feel like something. All right? And yet we can hear a piece of music that will move us to tears. We can see a sunset that makes us stand in awe, and we feel it. Okay? How does that happen? How do you go from just data? Our computers could detect a sunset. They could detect it. But our computers don't say, I can hardly stand it. It's so beautiful. It just detects it, knows what it is, identifies it. You get the information. We feel it. Okay? Where does that come from? Nobody knows. Where does it go from just raw data to feeling? Well, life. One of the great mysteries of science. How do you have a bunch of raw material and now all of a sudden it's living? You have inert matter, and at some point it's living. Dr. Frankenstein notwithstanding, it's not lightning. We don't know what it is. There is no point at which any physicist or biologist or anybody else can point and say, okay, here's non-life, here is the point where it becomes life, and the way it does that is by this mechanism. Nobody's got a clue. There might not even be a point. It may just be something that, some scientists talk about emergence. You've heard the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. You ever think about that? Something that is more than the parts it's made up of. It would be like if you built yourself an automobile and the automobile started cooking your dinner. Well, you'd wonder, how did that happen? We don't know. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us lots of things because people have all kinds of experiences. But what I'm trying to say is there is got to be, I believe firmly, something that got that going. Who else is this but the one we call Lord, the Creator, the one who gives meaning and direction? If that is nothing, if it's all mechanisms, if it's all just machinery, as Newton said, for example, then what's the point? Anything that happens in our life means nothing. It's just the result of a mechanism. And our feelings, our emotion, our insights, our response, our sense of joy, our sense of loss, our sense of devastation, our sense of acceptance, our sense of love, doesn't mean anything. And then the question is, then why do we have them? Why aren't we just machines? Because we come from love, which is another way of saying the Creator. We come from love. We live in love, and we go to love. Now, this is complicated. I admit that's a mystery too. But the key here is understanding, and by the way, in science, we're getting more and more scientists who are acknowledging this. The Professor Jeans that I mentioned, there was a guy, Freeman Dyson, who died a few years ago, said, the more I study the cosmos, the more I think that it had us in mind. James Jeans, his famous comment was, the more I study the cosmos, the less I see it as a machine, and the more I see it as mind. Well, who is that mind? What is that mind? I think it's the one that we refer to as God, as the Creator. There is a reality that is beyond us. It can't be expressed in words. We can sometimes, and we're human beings, so we want to express things. Sometimes the way to express something is to sing, to play an instrument, to compose music, to paint a picture, to write a play, to write poetry. Sometimes it's just to go, yay, or sometimes it's to let your tears out. Sometimes that's the only way we can express it if we start putting it in paragraphs. There is no mathematical equation. When we experience beauty, they can hook you up to machines that will record the functions of your brain. But when you replay those functions, those recordings, you don't have the experience. You just see the effect that it has on the physical brain. But it's not the experience. Where does that exist? Somewhere in the soul. Where's the soul? Does anybody ever figure that one out? Tell me. We have the mystery of existence. But that mystery of existence is, I believe, and I believe that this is what the faith is about, and I believe what today we celebrate is about, is it's of ultimate purpose. And that every life, not only every life, but everything in creation, all that vast, huge, gargantuan creation beyond our comprehension is meaningful because it comes from, exists in, and leads to the Creator. And Father Dennis Edwards was a theologian I knew from Australia who used to talk about creation being like, creation is not finished. It's ongoing. It wasn't done and out. It's still going on. We now are the conscious participants in it, for better or for worse. But creation is much like parents. One parent has the toddler, or the baby, the infant who's becoming a toddler, holding it up. And the other parent sits over there in front of it, and they let it go, and it toddles along, maybe falls on its butt the first few times, but eventually it makes it across the way, and parents rejoice. That's the Creator. The Creator is at the beginning and is at the end. That's the point. And I think that gives us, at least it does me, a great sense of joy. Because my life, your life, the life of your children, the life of your pets, the life of your garden, all that exists means something. It's not just an accident of mechanistic factors. It comes from someplace, and it's going somewhere. Woody Allen, in one of his essays years ago, wrote once, he said, it's very sobering to ponder the size, the vastness of the universe, of the size, how insignificant we are in the universe. And that's a very disturbing thought when you've just made the down payment on a new house. And I understand the point that he's making, but at the same time, I don't agree with it. I also think of one of my favorite books is T.H. White's The Once and Future King. He was an English writer. The book was written, I think, in the late 40s. And it was based on the legends of King Arthur. And at the end of the book, Arthur's dreams have collapsed. His desire, his dream of a kingdom that was peaceful, just, plentiful, where people looked out for one another, where they were safe from suffering and from the sorrows of life, had collapsed. And he himself was getting ready, as this new day was dawning, that he was going to war with who had been his best friend Lancelot and his wife Guinevere. And his heart is broken. And yet he thinks, a seed has been planted. Something is different now. My dreams did not come to fruition, but I had it. And the dream still lives. Life still goes on. There's new possibilities, new choices, new people coming along. And I can't say this line without getting teared up. He says at one point, every life is just a tiny little drop in the vast ocean of life, but a bright and shining one. Let's rise now and make our profession of faith. I believe in one God, creator